Before I do, I want to address what I think is a great tragedy in the American church. And that is, we are plagued in the church with an identity crisis. Everywhere I go, I encounter believers that have almost an impossible time really pegging down who they are in Christ. And that's because so many of us have only learned to define ourselves by what we do in Christ. So if we have a good week where we feel like we did more good than bad, we have almost an invisible balance system inside of our spirit man where we weigh the bad words and the thoughts and the actions. And on the other side, we think about how many times we read and prayed and what we gave and who we helped. And we sort of balance those two out inside. And if the good outweighs the bad, our self-worth goes up a little bit in the eyes of God. In fact, we'll even throw it into our prayers and say, Lord, I've really done all I can do this week to be a servant of the Lord and a soldier. I just believe that, God, you're going to bless people that are faithful. And Lord, I'm trying my best to be faithful. And we're really just throwing in front of God our deeds and our actions and then pulling the slot machine of heaven's favor and crossing our fingers and going, I hope that in God's eyes, my good outweighed my bad. How many of you know that's a frustrating way to live? How many of you also know that it's an unbelieving way to live? Because it does not trust God as the Redeemer of our soul. It does not trust God as the favor giver. It really puts us in the driver's seat to determine how well God treats us and how good God is to us. And so it's a disaster waiting to happen. And yet our identity is so often wrapped up in our performance. In fact, it's societal. Whenever we meet someone new, oh, hi, my name is Paul, my name is Bob. Bob, what do you do? Why is one of the first questions we ask people, what do you do? We don't ask them anything about their hopes, dreams, or aspirations. Maybe, quite frankly, we don't care. And the reason we don't care is because we don't yet know if Bob is worth getting to know. And the only way we're going to know if Bob's worth getting to know is ask Bob what he does, because what he does will help us determine Bob's value in our life. So if Bob doesn't do anything we respect, we're going to distance ourselves from Bob, because Bob doesn't help us any. Bob doesn't make a difference in our life. Bob doesn't improve me if I know Bob. But if Bob has a great job and a great rep and a great name, then we might want to pull closer to Bob, because Bob might do something for me somewhere down the road, because we wait to determine their value based upon what they do. Now, if we're doing that to people in society, can you imagine what we're doing in the church? Determining our value based upon our performance. I, for one, am glad to serve a God who values me because I'm me. Who values you just because you're you. You see, I don't place different levels of value on my son than I do my daughter. And I don't place a different level of value on my son when he has a particularly good week. And then when he has a rough week and things don't go well and the grades slip, maybe he gets in trouble at school, maybe he's not listening to his mom, and I devalue him and say, you know what, he's not worth as much to me this week. That's foolishness. There's not a parent in the world that parents that way. But we still hold that somehow, some way in our Christianity. And that's a tragedy. Because what I'm noticing in people's lives is the only reason that Christians are walking in defeat. The only reason that Christians are walking in discouragement. The only reason that they wonder about whether God will. Oh, I know He can, but Pastor, I just don't know if He will. The only reason is because we have an identity problem. We just don't know what the Father thinks of us. Thank God Jesus can help us clear that up. Look at John chapter 15. I want to start in verse 12. Jesus, talking to His disciples, says this: "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than a man lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. No longer do I call you servants, because a servant does not know what his master's doing. But I've called you friends. For all things that I heard from my Father I've made known to you. You did not choose me, I chose you, and appointed you, that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask the Father in my name, He may give you. These things I command you, that you love one another. Now, I don't know if you noticed bookends. I like to call them bookends. You put bookends on a shelf to hold the books together, and the bookends are usually matching. Whatever's on the one side is usually on the other side. Jesus bookends a passage with the same phrase. On both ends of the bookshelf is a commandment. He starts this passage by saying, "This is my commandment, that you love one another the way I have loved you." And then he goes on to talk about why. Because you and I are friends. You're not a servant. You're not a slave. I don't treat you like a servant. The master doesn't tell his servant all of his secrets, but he'll tell his friend all of his secrets. And I don't want to live in a relationship with you where you don't know what Daddy and I are thinking. Rather, I want you to believe that you and I are on a level playing field, that you're my friend, that I'm your friend. I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'll speak into your heart. And then, by the way, this is my commandment. He goes back and he repeats the same commandment. And he says that you love one another as I have loved you. So he starts the conversation by letting you know what he expects out of you. And what does he expect out of you? That you love one another. How? The way God, through Christ, loves you. So it's not just some arbitrary love. If you know how loved you are, you take that love and you share it with other people. So the first piece of information you need is, how loved am I? And when you know how loved you are, then you take that love and you share it with other people. I think Jesus starts with this because it's impossible for the servant or the slave to comprehend the word love. I mean, the servant or the slave never looks at his master in loving terms. A servant or a slave doesn't, the slave doesn't have to love the master. In fact, why would he? And B, the master certainly doesn't have to love the slave or the servant. It's just like a boss, an employer and an employee. The employee, or let's start with the employer. The employer doesn't have to love his employees, but he has an obligation to provide for them financially if they do the job, and to provide a safe environment and give them opportunity. And as most everybody would attest, the employee certainly doesn't have to love the employer. They don't have to love your boss, but you're required to go and do whatever they're paying you to do. And so that's a loveless relationship. I won't go around the room and ask you how many of you don't love your jobs or don't like your boss or wish you could do something else tomorrow. We'll leave that alone. So Jesus takes us out of that realm. He just flat says, listen, a servant doesn't even understand the Father's heart, but a son, a friend is different, because a friend knows what's happening.